So hello from my side. My name is Volker Lendecke, and as Jim said, I'm one of the very few ones who has attended each and every of these sambaXP conferences. This talk, the official title is a quarter of century of sambaXP. In fact, it starts much earlier, this talk. It really starts how I got into Samba. And I really want to tell you a personal story of what I see are the main points in the development of Samba that changed Samba, that made Samba available in more areas and so on. And it started for me when I was a student here in Göttingen. I was studying mathematics, and I did have access to Usenet. My father had a small business dealing with sewing machines, professional sewing machines. And he had like 2 or 3 people working for him, and they had to share files. And this was running on NetWare. And as usual, I was the geek in the family. I had to administrate. But it was really, really annoying that I couldn't really understand what was going on really down below. And in the university, I really enjoyed that Tridge posted somewhere, and to be honest, I really don't remember, that he had written an SMB server with that name actually. And he was claiming that it can serve Microsoft clients for file shares, for drive redirections for free. And so I didn't have internet at home, so I had to copy that stuff to floppy disks, take it home. For a Linux distribution of like 30 disks, it took usually 2 or 3 attempts to have disks without reading errors then. And I don't remember how much it took for Samba, but I guess it could fit on one floppy disk, one of these 3.5-inch ones with 1.4 megabytes. We fixed that. So I was in the lucky position to have a Next workstation at home, so a Unix machine. This was kind of before I had started with Linux. And I made it build on Nextstep. I made it build on Nextstep badly, but it worked. And I installed a Windows msclient.exe redirector, and I was hooked. So I could share files from my Next workstation to a Microsoft MS-DOS 3.11 client, and I said, okay, Novell is dead. My first patches were actually, so I tried that, I rebooted my Windows client, and I saw a zombie process. I had no idea what a zombie process is. Obviously, Tridge didn't have an idea what a zombie process is back then either. I read a bit about what a zombie process is, and so I had to add in some sick child handling. Everybody here, or many people hopefully know what a sick child handling here is. And these were my first patches. My email address was namu01 which is the Applied Mathematics Unix 01 workstation on DEC Ultrix back then. So this is how it started for me. Then in between, I had added to the upcoming Linux operating system, I had added smbFS, which was the first client file system that could mount Windows workstations, Windows or OS2 or whatever SMB servers. This over time got replaced by Steve French's CIFS.ko, CIFS file system, but it was my first contribution to the Linux kernel, and this triggered this email. In August '96, Microsoft, and I'll talk a bit about that later, Microsoft told me, hey, we are doing a CIFS conference. CIFS conference. What is CIFS? I had no idea what really CIFS is. And this eventually, over the years, turned into the annual Storage Developer Conference, now hosted by SNIA. So since 1996, there is a conference in the Silicon Valley. This was in Seattle, where Microsoft campus is. Every year there's a conference in Silicon Valley where SMB is one strong topic. It's now about general storage, but Microsoft essentially started what I see as a sequence of conferences as a pure CIFS conference back then. So I was a student, I had no money, I didn't know how to get to Seattle. They told me, don't worry, go to Frankfurt, go to that counter, you will have a ticket there. I went there and I saw, okay, this is a row like 8 or so in the plane. And I said, this can't be true. So yes, it was actually a business class ticket that they gave me for free. My first and only business class flight to Seattle, paid by Microsoft. And what I want to show a bit later, so Tridge was there, Jeremy was there, a few others were there, and yeah, these slides that I will show in a few minutes are still kind of a good reference about the points that CIFS or SMB implementers until today have to take care of. So what is CIFS? Common Internet File System? No, it's not common. There were others back then. Can it run over the internet? No, it's not encrypted. Samba, much later, introduced a transport encryption for SMB1 based on GSS API, but it never went anywhere because Windows didn't implement it. Is it a file system? I mean, this is really a contention point. People argue about this. For me, a file system is something that turns a disk, a set of blocks, into a file abstraction, into directories, and so on. Yeah, but NFS is also called file system. AFS is also called file system. So yes, let it be a file system. Why did Microsoft implement CIFS or rebrand the SMB protocol, server message block protocol, to CIFS? Because Sun Microsystems had made an announcement that they would market their network file system as web NFS. So file sharing over the web. And what did they add to the NFS file system, to the NFS protocol? So NFS is also, like SMB, really, really chatty on the wire, because when you want to open a file that's somewhere deep down in a directory hierarchy, you have to go step by step, which means /A/B/C and so on, 5 round trips. And what Sun added is multi-component lookups so that you can directly go and open a very deep file with 1 round trip, which for the internet is really important. You don't want round trips. They also added server-side symlink resolution, and I'm very sad that Jeremy isn't here, because I would expect a reaction from Jeremy. What did Microsoft add? So back then, you remember NetBIOS session service? When you connected to a SMB server back then, what you had to do, you had to call the server by its real name, because of the NetBIOS transport that was sitting below TCP, or sitting on top of TCP between TCP and SMB. So you had to tell the server, the very first packet was, hey, I'm Volker, and you are server foo. And if you didn't get the name foo right, it would reject the session. And what Microsoft did for CIFS is they defined star SMB server as the generic server name that you could call a server when connecting initially. That's it. At least as far as I read the specs. Oh, I promised you that I would like to show you Tridge's slides from 1996 here. And if you go through these, you will find that he points out many of the things that are still relevant today when you want to implement SMB on top of a Unix file, on top of a Unix API. Unix API is different, much simpler API. I think we got over that. So I don't think it's simpler anymore. Is it interesting for people? Yes. Even in 96, we had, largest site had 15,000 users on 1,200 servers. I think back then it was the Bank of America running on Samba on Sun. These questions are still relevant. Kernel user space. Now in the SMB Linux space, we have both. We have Samba and we have a KSMBD. So you have the option. Process model, one client per process. There's all one client per process or one process for all clients in a multi-threaded fashion. Still a contention point where people discuss Samba sucks because it's multi-process, which kind of is its downside, but it has saved us big time very, very often. Printer handling, yeah, that's not really SMB anymore. Password synchronization, server share security. Nobody remembers share security anymore, but still the authentication model of Unix is completely simplistic. SMB is, well, if you go to customers, SMB authentication and ID mapping and so on is still not really solved so that everybody can understand it. But this is just in the nature of authentication and authorization. That's just a complex topic. We got over the undocumented part. I'll go to that. Wait a second. CIFS for Unix to Unix. We solved that one. Eventually we solved this because now we can, like 30 years later, we can claim that if you take a CIFS client, you will have soft links, you will have Unix attributes, you have these GRZs and so on. You'll have all that. We have better authentication. We have an implementation 30 or 28 years later. Okay. The next big step for Samba was the NT4 compatible domain controller. If you go back very far, from OS2 heritage, I would believe, is a Microsoft MS RAP specification. So if you are in a LAN manager environment, you have things like users, you have things like workstation logins, you have things like printers or whatever, and OS2 serves this via a remote administration protocol, RAP. Nobody does this anymore, but back then, this would have been the obvious choice, from my perspective, to add things that Novell had done for their NetWare binary. Microsoft chose something else. They chose the distributed computing environment RPC system, which is huge. The specification is huge. It defines a very flexible but complex RPC mechanism. DCE RPC, I'm not sure if it strictly needs it, but it benefits tremendously from a stable, from a TCP-like, so reliable transport. And back then, we were still in the world of NetBEUI, of IPX, of something. Not everybody had TCP available. So what Microsoft did is they defined a way to transmit DCE-RPC over SMB. And this is actually the topic of this book. So this is a book from Luke Kenneth Casson-Leeton, DCE-RPC over SMB. And Microsoft, when they wanted essentially to build something that is a competitor to Novell's Novell NetWare's binary, which is essentially a user database over the network, they chose DCE-RPC. And of course, when we wanted to implement a Windows NT4 compatible domain controller, we had to implement this. And this took really long to get right, essentially right in the sense that we have a clean architecture. It took like until Samba 4.16 to get this kind of right. And there were a lot of things in between. Luke Kenneth Casson-Leeton was one of the driving forces behind it. And he implemented a lot of it. And sometime later, we could claim that we have a Samba domain controller. So if you look at what happens on the wire, and I'll get back to that term later, DCE-RPC over SMB is a multi-layer abstraction using SMB as a reliable transport to transmit back and forth remote procedure calls with whatever layering levels and so on. Many layers. It really, really looks like a mess. And this is exactly what this book is about, which you have seen a few minutes ago. And so we have fragmentation mechanisms that DCE can do itself. Then we have several layers of fragmentation in SMB as such, so it really looks weird. Back then, Samba did everything with so-called hand marshalling. What is that? If you look at what we have now, like a specification, a clean specification for RPC calls like list me all users a Windows domain holds, like get me whatever, log me in as user Volker against this domain. This is all very high-level calls that are nowadays defined in interface definition language. We didn't have anything back then. Or we did have TCP dump. We didn't have any Wireshark that could really show the different, what's the username that I get back as first user, what's the username I get back as a second user, and so on. All these higher level concepts that the RPC calls define, we didn't have any of this. So what we had to do is do hand marshalling, do a lot of tweaking of little whatever. This byte is unknown, this whatever, uint32. We didn't even know that we have a uint32, 32-bit unsigned integer here. We didn't have anything. And this is one of the big things that Tridge and Luke did to actually get an NT4 compatible domain controller right. I list here why French versions of NT4 helped. Why? Back then we were still in the world where crypto laws were very strict. And France, so there is some crypto to this. France just prohibited all use of crypto. So if you installed a Windows NT workstation, a Windows NT server, you could just select, okay, I can't read the GUI anymore, but I can read the network now. And so this helped a lot. And we also learned a lot about Windows internal log files and some creative use of a debugger and so on. So eventually we figured that out. Then Luke essentially kind of went too far ahead in the view of the Samba team. So he essentially wanted to turn Samba into a Windows-like architecture. And essentially he wanted to split these RPC services into separate daemons. And this is what we think Windows works internally. We don't have access to Windows source code, but this is what we think how Windows works internally. So you have your daemon to remotely list your registry, to remotely whatever do printing. We believe that this is separate services in Windows, and Luke wanted this back then to actually be separate daemons and model the whole Samba architecture around that. And maybe it was too quick, but there was some internal discussions that essentially led to the Samba, the next generation fork. So which is a good thing, that you can fork free software. And Samba TNG essentially after a few years stopped working or stopped developing because there was just not enough manpower behind that to really drive this forward. So Samba essentially in 2001 finally shipped a Windows DC, and I really had to look hard, or I had to search a lot of what's new files. The ability to act as an authentication source for Windows 2000 clients as well as NT4 clients. I mean, this was big. This was really big, and it was just a one-liner in our really, really long what's new file for Samba 2.2. So kind of an understatement. Next big thing, EU Commission versus Microsoft. This changed the whole landscape for many, many years. I looked up the case in Wikipedia, and they claim that in 1998, Sun Microsystems complained that with the EU Commission, that Microsoft is anti-competitive. Essentially, they are an illegal monopoly. That's what Sun claimed, and they complained with the EU Commission. And eventually, in 2007, Microsoft was fined to open their protocols. A lot of this was about Windows Media Player. So, and this is why you, for a long time, I don't know if that's still around, these Windows N versions. Do you remember these? Are they still around? Do we still have Windows N versions? Just for this case. And so it was bundling of media, I think it was Real Player. Bundling of a media player with Microsoft was seen as illegal. And the third bullet point here is what really was the point that the Commission successfully fought against Microsoft. So it's not illegal to have a monopoly. And Microsoft was essentially found to have a monopoly on the desktop market back then. macOS wasn't that big. What is illegal if you use that monopoly to gain market dominance in a different market. And this is what Microsoft was found to abuse illegally. So some Microsoftians claimed that Microsoft is using their desktop monopoly to also gain dominance in the workgroup server market. What is a workgroup server? Are these different markets? Very, very difficult question that is legally not easy to answer. Next one is, what does on the wire mean? When you go to lawyers, judges, and we say, okay, our understanding what on the wire means, to me as an engineer, it's entirely clear. You open Wireshark, you open TCP dump, what you see there is on the wire. Explain this to a judge. And Microsoft claimed, no, this is all intellectual property, this is ours, and so on. This is part of the operating system. What these weirdos want is our intellectual property. You can't do that. The next one is, are these protocols? So once we claimed, yes, there's a separate market for workgroup servers. Second, what actually is on the wire? And we don't want any of their source code. We don't want any of this. We want the IDL files, but this is not really source code. And then the next question is, are these protocols copyrightable? And under what conditions do we get access to the protocols? Very difficult questions. Eventually, Microsoft lost against the EU Commission. And then the last question, yes, there was still copyright on the protocol definitions. There is still copyright on the protocol definitions, but to be honest, I don't really care anymore because it's documented on the web. It's documented in ChatGPT, so I can use it. And so what Samba Team had to do is found the Protocol Freedom Information Foundation and paid I believe it was 10,000 euros. Jim, do you remember? 10,000 euros to Microsoft as a one-time fee to get access to these specs. And like half a year later, Microsoft just said, okay, it's not worth the hassle, just put it on the web. And this really, really changed Microsoft's attitude towards documenting their protocols, probably also internally in a good way. And the SMB and the on-prem protocols are still very, very well documented. And now, until the cloud happened, Azure protocols, somebody has to fight the same battle again against the cloud people. I mean, it's the same thing again. And yeah. So essentially, since 2007, we have access to protocol documentation. We have access to doc help, which is essentially somebody at Microsoft, and many people are here to help us when documentation is inaccurate, Windows behaves differently from documented and so on. But so we can ask, and we can be part of improving those documents. Next big step, Samba 4. We wanted clustered Samba. We have clustered Samba now, but Tritch said, okay, this is too messy the way we did it. And he wanted to do Samba right. And I didn't write it down, but essentially it's kind of the so-called second system syndrome. So he said, okay, I want to do it from scratch. I want to do it really, really the way it should be. What we ended up with is two things. First is smbtorture, which is a very, very comprehensive tool to test in smbserver, and many other vendors also use smbtorture to essentially validate their competing implementations. And yeah, there were some talks by Rich, but the file server never really made it. It's still in our source because it's used in some tests for printing, by the way. But it has never been used in production, the file server that came out of this. But smbtorture is still one of our core regression tools that still validate that we don't regress and we don't get too slow and so on. It helped the old SMBD that was still around to get much better. Active Directory came around. I mean, it was Windows 2000 was Active Directory. We were already behind with our 84 compatible domain controller from '96. We got much further behind with Active Directory. Luke Howard. Anybody remember Luke Howard? A professional pianist. Wrote, pardon?
He's composer.
Okay. Wrote an Active Directory clone based on OpenLDAP in his spare time. And you can still look it up as well as domain services for Windows. Can you still buy it? I don't know.
No.
Okay, but it's still, okay, I looked it up yesterday. There is some documentation for.
There's still support, there are still customers using it.
Okay.
On support.
Back then, OpenLDAP didn't want anything in their code. So what is Active Directory? It's Kerberos, it's DNS, and it's LDAP. Bundled together with RPC service and so on. Reluctant to accept anything that has not gone through the RFC process. And so we had to write our own LDAP. Then somebody in Cologne figured out the Active Directory multi-master replication as his bachelor thesis. That guy is sitting over here. And just without any whatever real good analysis tools, without any IDL and so on, it's still a miracle how he did it. So what did we have? We had, over time, an LDAP server. We had plugged in Heimdall Kerberos, and so on. We had an SMB server that was not really functional, but we had a different source tree, the old source tree, the old SMBD, in different source trees. And back then it was really a joke among ourselves, what would release first, Perl 6 or Samba 4? We made it. Perl 6 is not really as Perl 6 hasn't taken over the world. So eventually we took the Active Directory domain controller code. We put the SMBD that was humming along forever. We put that together into one source tree. Took a while, but eventually we could release an Active Directory domain controller as Samba 4.0. So what's the future? We fixed what Luke Leeton wanted to fix with Samba TNG. So we separated out all this very complex code that implements the RPC services. We have a separate spool daemon for printing. We have a separate daemon for registry. We have a separate daemon for SemR, which is our user database, and so on. All separate daemons. So this is what I see as a quite big achievement, that our code base is becoming clean. So SMBD, there's one thing that SMBD still does, which I think doesn't belong there, which is a good part of the authentication code. We should separate that out somewhere else. But right now, if you look at your process list, SMBD does not much beyond the pure SMB protocol. I think all big SMB protocol elements are done. Not all of them are upstream yet. The last big one is right now under review, which is persistent handles. I think everything else is pretty much done. With Unix extensions for SMB3, I think we are a good competitor to NFS. There have been a lot of talks about this, and I think Steve will also give some current update on what we have for Linux to Linux using SMB. but the world moves on. Active Directory, local Active Directory on-prem is not really the hot shit anymore. It's all going to the cloud, to Entra, to whatever, OpenID, to whatever, and we will have talks about this. An SMB server on-prem is not really what people want data to live anymore, where people want data to live anymore. It's S3 or whatever service. Then to serve files, to serve AI ingestion artifacts, NVIDIA really has extreme bandwidth and latency requirements. And yeah, that's the developments that we have to face. So there's no end of Samba feature requests like we want zero latency, we want RDMA, we have RDMA now. We want extreme bandwidth, no whatever. We want to authenticate with Entra ID accounts, and so on and so forth. We want quick to connect to a Samba server over the internet, the quick protocol, we have that now. So, but work ahead is not ending. And this is why our Samba Foundation essentially was established yesterday. Unfortunately, I couldn't be part of this due to other duties, was founded on Friday night. And this will be a framework like KDE-EV, like the CEF Foundation, where people can contribute both money, code, time, whatever. And so we want a stable future for Samba where everybody who is interested, who has stakes, wants to contribute. And that's essentially from 1994 to today. Literally today. Thanks for your attention. I got the 5-minute one. I think I have time for one question.